today we're going to be doing a review, an overview of all the things that we've learned so far on this series of titled In the Beginning. We had made a statement in the very early part of this series saying that most every major theme that we come across in the Bible finds its start from these first three chapters. And so the way that we read these first three chapters of the Bible will form our mind and get us ready and prepared for all the things that come ahead of us. The idea of who God is, the idea of who we are as human beings, our purpose in this world, what happened, what accounts for all of the chaos in the world around us, what is God doing about it, and what does he expect us to do as we move towards the reconciliation of all these things. So Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 tell us about all of these things. So hopefully we'll have all these things in mind, but it's good for us to review them. So let's remember again, the Bible was written in Hebrew in the Old Testament, and then there's a portion of the Old Testament, a small portion that's written in Aramaic. The New Testament is mostly Greek, and a little bit again of Aramaic shows up there as well. The language of the Hebrew language is not the same language that any of us speak. And so there's a linguistic gap between the way they talk and the way they communicate and the way that we communicate. For sometimes there's still, as familiar as we are with English, there's still a communication gap between English and our mother tongue. And that gap has to be kept in mind, because when we read the Bible in English or in Malayalam or whatever language is most comfortable for us, sometimes we might think that we immediately and quickly understand everything that's going on. But this is an ancient text that takes quite a bit of effort for us to be able to get rid of our 2021 mindset and read it like they meant it to be read. When the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, when all these books are written, they're not thinking the same questions that you and I are thinking. They're not thinking about how the evolution of human beings came, and they're not answering any of those questions. To them, science is a non-existent field of study. For them, what matters is understanding the deep mysteries of God and the reality that they see around them. So it's very important that we be careful to read it in a very humble manner, knowing that the more humble we can be when we read the Bible, the more open we can be to understand what it's trying to communicate to us. The more we come to the Bible with a sense of, I'm very smart and I know how to figure these things out, the more likely we will be to push our message onto the words of the Bible, and the less likely we will be to hear what God is trying to tell us. The main questions that the people in those days had, and the people we today still have, is, where is God? Who is God? How did we get to be here? And why are we here to begin with? What is our purpose in this world? Those are the major questions that they had to wrestle with, and we still have to wrestle with. And so when we read the Bible, the very first verse, in the beginning, God created, immediately we're struck with a very important lesson. Now, if I tell you the water that I'm drinking is hot, you might immediately think you know what I'm talking about, because maybe you've had hot water before. You would have, of course, had it. And so in your mind, if I say I'm drinking hot water, you're immediately thinking of the temperature of the water, and you know what it feels like in your mouth. But what if I told you that the water that I'm drinking is lukewarm, really, but it feels like it's hot to me because I'm so used to drinking cold water all the time? So just the phrase, I'm drinking hot water, can be easily misunderstood if you don't understand the context in which it's being said. Um, a lot of times, our kids, when they eat something, they'll say, oh, it's too spicy. Now, if we go to someone's house and they say that the food is too spicy, they'll wonder, oh, is it really too spicy? Because they're thinking of their terms of spiciness, and we have to tell them, no, if they look at a banana, they think that's spicy. And so their concept of spiciness is different than our concept of spiciness. Once we understand that, we're least bit bothered when they say that this food is too spicy. We tell them, you eat it anyways. So when we read Genesis, it's in the context of an ancient culture. There's the Babylonians around, there's this Assyrian people around, there's the Canaanites who are around. So many ancient cultures are there, and they all have their way of explaining who God is, why are we here, and how did we come to be here, and what is our purpose. They all have their different ways of explaining it. In every single one of those cultures, there's a fight that happens. There's a wrestling between different gods. There is in the Akkadian account, so that's the Enuma Elish is the name of this ancient story. The fight is between one god who's tearing apart the sea, and he uses the wind to rip open the mouth of the sea god and then cuts him in half, and out of that bloody mess comes creation. The ancient Egyptians had a concept that there, in the very beginning, there's this ancient water, some sort of a dark water that's there. And from this water, it just naturally gives birth to the first God. In those accounts, and you hear that, and then when you read Genesis chapter 1, you understand how significantly different it is that the Jewish articulation is. They say, listen, in the beginning, there was God. Not in the beginning, there was water, or in the beginning, there were so many gods and they wrestled. No, in the beginning, there's just one. There is only one God. And so we're immediately struck with the supremacy of God, the oneness of God over everything. And how does he create? And we talked about this by the word of his mouth. By just speaking forth, everything comes into existence. So there's no fight, there's no power struggle. Our God is supremely in control. Now, when we know that, it helps us to understand that when we go through difficult situations in our lives, we are not scrambling like people who are wondering and hoping which God will come and save us. Which God do we pray to? We know there's only one God, and this God can speak order into chaos. So definitely this God, if we read in this way, we can be confident that that same God can bring order into the different situations that we go through in life. Now, we talked about the oneness of God, but then we also mentioned that in Genesis chapter 1, there's also this mysterious plurality of God that's mentioned. God is one, but there's this creative power of God, that's his speech, that comes out of him and it creates the world. John, the gospel writer, the apostle John, it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. So John had Genesis chapter 1 in his mind, and he's using those themes and those categories to explain how complex and beautiful our God is. He is a God who, like in Genesis chapter 1, is unseen. We don't get any picture of who God is in Genesis chapter 1. We don't know where he is. He's somewhere and he's speaking. The only thing that we can connect with is the word of his mouth. That's the thing that creates and connects with all of the physical reality. And so this is setting up a category, a way of thinking in the Jewish mind to get them prepared for when God shows up in flesh, in person. And it shouldn't have been a great surprise to the people. For us Christians, we've accepted this fact, and this fact comes all the way from Genesis chapter 1. And then we also looked at the other part of the Trinity, which is the Spirit. There was the Spirit of God that was hovering over the face of the deep. Now, we didn't talk about every single thing when we were doing our series, but now that I've made that quick mention of the other ancient cultures, see, hopefully you'll hear the distinction. In the ancient Babylonian culture, where this Enuma Elish story came, where the god Marduk used the wind and ripped the sea in half. Well, there's a wind present in Genesis chapter 1, but the wind is God. And the wind doesn't have to fight. It just hovers over the face of the deep. And within no time, from verse, you can just go back and read it, right? So Genesis chapter 1, let's pull it up. Genesis chapter 1, in that very second verse, the earth was a formless void and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind of God swept over the face of the waters. So immediately you get and we didn't talk about this last time. We go from the first part that there's formless void. And now that the wind of God is there, now it's not called a formless void. It's called the face of the waters. Somehow that scary darkness has been calmed and tamed already just by the very presence of the Spirit of God. So again, we're getting a picture of who God is, of how he operates. We talked about the ordering of creation and the filling of creation. The earth was a formless void. That means it was an unorganized, empty space. In Genesis chapter 1, day 1, 2, and 3, God is bringing order to everything. In days 4, 5, and 6, he is filling everything. Right? So we see that God is very intentional. None of the chaos that we see around us is outside of God's control. One thing that we didn't mention that we can just quickly mention now, when does light come? On day 1. When does the sun come? On day 4. So that means that there is a light that is independent of the sun. If God created the sun first, then everyone will say, oh, it's the sun that gives us light. But now that God created the light first, who do we say is the author and creator of light? God. God is the author and creator of light. And that's why when we get to the end of the book of Revelation chapter 22, there's no more sun and there's still light because the light comes from God. So all of these categories are being set up for us. And if we catch on to them, it makes sense. In our Kurbana service, how do we start it? In your light, we see the light, Jesus, full of light. But knowing that the light has been established by God means that every act of illumination that occurs is directly attributed to God and his sovereignty in this world, not to any other subpower in this world, not to science or human buddhi or anything like that. If there is light, it comes from God. Right? So we looked at the parallels between, on day 1, there's light. Day 2, there's the separation of the sky and the waters below. There's the water above and the water below. Remember how that category comes up again, even in the story of Noah. Remember, so there's water everywhere and God pushes some of the water up into the sky and pushes the rest of the water down and he separates it. What happens in Genesis chapter 9 onwards when the flood story, or 6 onwards when the flood story occurs, right? The people were completely corrupt and evil, and so basically they don't want God. So what happens when God withdraws? Where does the flood come from? Maybe based on our children's stories, we may still think that the flood came from the sky, but that's not 100% true. The flood came from the sky and from the ground. So when you go back and read it, the waters below and the waters above. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if we're remembering Genesis chapter 1, we know that God was the one that separated these things. And now when we reject God, he withdraws his power and things collapse back in on itself. So we get an understanding of why the world is disordered, because of God's withdrawal from it. If the people reject God, then he will move his hand away. But we will soon see that even in Genesis chapter 3, that God will not let go of us that easily. Even if we reject him, he chases after us. So we'll see all that still. In day 3, we saw the sea is pushed to the side, and now finally you have land. And day 4, 5, and 6, you fill the sky, you fill the waters above, and you fill the waters below. The waters above are filled with the birds. The waters below are filled with the fish. And then on day 6, you have animals and humans. On every day, there's a phrase that's mentioned. And it was evening, and it was morning, the blank day, the first day. And it was evening, and it was morning, the second day. There's only one day that doesn't have this. Anyone know? Which is the one day that's missing this phrase? It's day 7. Day 7 doesn't seem to end, according to Genesis chapter 1. Actually, it shows up in Genesis chapter 2, the way that our numbering system is, which is a much later addition to the Bible. In Genesis chapter 2, in the first verses, when we see the Sabbath day coming, we are reminded, and this is one more major theme, this is how the world should be. It is organized by God. Human beings are made in his image, and then they're told to work. And then their very first day that they experience life is the Sabbath day. And there seems to be no end to the Sabbath, which is exactly what the book of Revelation culminates with. So Revelation chapter 22 should not be a surprise to us. An eternal rest, an eternal shalom or peace. It was told to us from the very first story in the Bible. So the Bible, it's beautiful to think of a Bible physically as a book, because when you open it up, you see that this part maps onto this part. And so when you open it, if you just read Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 and onwards, it kind of gets reversed through the life of Jesus. Jesus undoes all of these things and he brings us back into the paradise, into the garden. And by the time you get to Revelation chapter 21, the heaven and earth come back together. And we're talking about that in our Heaven and Earth series. And then by Revelation chapter 22, it's the full Sabbath imagery again. So this category again comes from Genesis chapter 1. So we learned about who God is, how he organizes things. And then we also learned a lot about who we are in this world. Genesis chapter 1 says that we are created in his image. Genesis chapter 2 says we're created from the dirt of the ground. From the Adamah comes Adam, right? From the ground in Hebrew comes the human, Adam. So we're given this contrasting picture. In Genesis chapter 2, also the breath of God is breathed directly into his nostrils. So we have to balance this as a Christian, to know that on one hand that we are beautifully and wonderfully and fearfully made, according to the psalmist, but then on the other hand, we are just dust. From dust we came, to dust we will return. In one hand, we need to thank God and respect all the other human beings around us, because God's image is in every single one. And on the other hand, we need to be extremely humble always, because at any moment, this fragile body can fall apart if not for the Spirit of God keeping us together. This is a major idea that we learn. In the ancient cultures, everyone is dust, except for the kings, the pharaoh or the emperor. those people, they're created in God's image. They're the ones who look like God. They're the ones who are the representatives of God. But the ancient Israelites had a radical idea. And they said, no, every single person, from King David down to the lowest of the servants in the field, everyone is created in the image of God, and every single one of us will turn to dust when the time comes. How humbling and uplifting this concept is for us. We learned about the purpose of humans. We learned that humans were put in this world to till it and to keep it, to multiply and to subdue it. Meaning that word subdue in Genesis chapter 1, to reign over it, it's the same word that's given to the stars in the sky. They need to rule the sky and we need to rule the earth. God's nature also is tied up in this. A good leader is someone that can bring other people into positions of responsibility. A good leader is not someone who spoon feeds you every single thing that you need. A good leader is someone who enables you and equips you so that you can do the same task that they do. God, the creator, creates, and then he turns over to his creation and he says, okay, now you go, you have my image, go and create, go and rule this world in the way that I'm asking you to be. Now, unfortunately, humans have spoiled that opportunity. And we, instead of ruling it in a godly way, we have decided to rule it in our own way. And that's when we get into Genesis chapter 3, because we've been given this purpose to co-rule with God, which is why it shouldn't come as any surprise when Jesus says that on that day, right, you all will be seated in positions of authority and you will be judges and you will be rulers. Now, what does that mean? Well, some people only lock away those responsibilities for some distant future. But what that means is this was always the original intention that God had for his creation, that we would co-rule with him. Of course, God is the ruler above all. But in Genesis chapter 3, we are introduced to the answer to the question of why is the world so broken? If there is a good God, why is there so many wrong things in this world? Why is there evil in this world? And everyone has to wrestle with this question, not just Christians or religious people. Atheists have to wrestle with it too. And their answer to it is definitely not going to be satisfactory. Because if there is no God, if there is no way to distinguish what is right and what is wrong other than what we happen to feel or say at that time, then everything starts to fall apart. In one culture, it may be okay to have divorced your wife because you just don't like them. But we know that that's not right. That's not a godly thing. That doesn't promote life. And so who gets to decide what's right and wrong? In an atheist worldview, if there's no righteous judge above everything, then everything becomes very relative. Within our worldview, we still have to wrestle with why is it that a good God would allow evil in the world? And Genesis chapter 3 helps us to wrestle with that. Well, God is a God of love, and love always wants a reciprocal nature of love to come back. We love our children, and we hope that our children will love us back. We can't force them to love us. We can teach them to say thank you, and we can teach them to say please, and we can teach them to be polite and all these things. But in the end, it has to be a voluntary act of love on their part that makes it genuine. God knows that he can't force us to do what he tells us to do. He has to give us freedom because love only makes sense within the idea of context of freedom. And so Genesis chapter 3 is the story of freedom. We have read it as a story of the one rule that has been broken, but we talked about the major themes in Genesis chapter 3. The main command that God gives is not, do not eat. The primary speech that God gives is, eat freely of all the trees in the garden except that one. And how the serpent twisted it, and how Eve misunderstood it, and how we have rejected the freedom that God gives, and instead we try to do and rule the world our way. And when we do that, when we decide that we want to discern between right and wrong, even though God told us what right and wrong is, when we decide to do it ourselves, then suddenly our shame becomes so apparent and we see our nakedness. And that's how the story goes. Now, there's this forever mystery of, how can you be in paradise, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Delight? How can you be in that place and then do the wrong thing? Well, this profound mystery is not just something that we read in Genesis chapter 3. This profound mystery happens every single day of your life and my life. Why is it that we wake up? God just gave us breath to breathe. When we open our eyes and see a new day, God's provided for us. Why do we then choose to do things our way? Right? As mysterious as it is to look at Adam and Eve, let's remember that the Genesis 1, 2, and 3 story holds a mirror up to each one of our lives. And these major themes that are taught to us are not history lessons. This is an ongoing class on how you and I operate in this world. And so we see that one more major theme that comes up is listening to the right voice. They listened to the voice of the serpent. Adam listened to the voice of his wife, and because of that, he was punished, or rather, the ground was cursed because of that. Remember in the Genesis chapter 3, what we call the punishment section, there are actually only two curses that happened. The first curse goes to the serpent. The second curse goes to the ground. The ground. In between, we see that the effects of sin, which causes painful procreation, right? In every new birth, there is a reminder of this pain, which links us back to that first fall, right? And then with every toiling labor that humans do in this world, we are reminded of that fall. But those things in and of themselves aren't actually the punishment, they're the consequence of our actions. And those things will all be reversed when the time comes too. And so this is this idea then that humanity continues to repeat this cycle of doing the thing that we're not supposed to do, of listening to the wrong voice. So what hope do we have? Genesis 3 gives us that hope. Genesis 1 also gave us that hope. Remember, the Sabbath day never ends. But Genesis 3 gives us this hope still. In Genesis chapter 3, there are those verses that say that the offspring of the serpent will strike the heel of the offspring of the woman, but the offspring of the woman will crush the head of this offspring of the snake, right? I will put, in verse 15 of Genesis chapter 3, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, you will strike his heel. Now, this is the foreshadowing of Jesus and the cross. On the cross, the serpent bit our Lord. And in ancient times, and even still, depending on where you are in the world and what it is that bites you, if you get bit by a snake, that's the end. You die. And so Jesus, it seemed like he lost the battle on the cross. But Genesis chapter 3 foreshadowed that no, it's just a striking of the heel. The seed of the woman will strike the head and crush the serpent once and for all. And so through death on the cross, death itself has been defeated. And so all of these ideas were foreshadowed in these very first chapters. Now, we had gone at length at all of the nuances between, but this is just today. It's supposed to be a wrap up. And so we'll pause here and we'll ask or take questions. If there are any questions, we can try and address those lingering loose ends, and then we will wrap up our series on In the Beginning.